We usually think of a United States passport as being written in permanent marker, but what if I told you a simple $7,000 tax error could act like a giant eraser, wiping away a person's American citizenship years after they took the oath?
Yeah, it completely flips our understanding of what it means to be a citizen. I mean, we treat it as this ultimate unbreakable binary, you are either in the club or you are out. But the legal reality is much more conditional.
Welcome to this deep dive, custom tailored just for you. Today, we are unpacking the surprising, rapidly evolving machinery of denaturalization. That's the formal process where the U.S. government strips citizenship away from naturalized Americans.
And we have a really fascinating stack of sources to go through today. We're looking at a June 2025 Department of Justice Civil Enforcement Memorandum, historical databases of revoked citizenships, some official press releases on federal fraud cases, and advisories from immigration defense lawyers.
Right. So our mission here is to figure out how and why the government revokes this ultimate status. We're tracing it from a tool used to hunt down historical war criminals to a modern dragnet catching financial fraudsters. So what does this all mean?
That's a huge shift.
It really is. I mean, how does a permanent status become impermanent? But before we get into tax returns and pandemic loans, we really need to establish a baseline. What did losing your citizenship traditionally look like?
Well, to understand the baseline, we have to look at the extreme edge of the spectrum. Historically, the government kept this tool locked away for the absolute worst offenders. Like after World War II, the focus was heavily on Nazis who had lied about their pasts to sneak into the U.S.
Right. I saw John Demjanjuk in the notes.
Exactly. And Karl Linus is another crazy example.
Okay, let's unpack his case. How does a former Nazi even get a U.S. passport in the first place?
By weaponizing the chaos of post-war Europe, basically.
Yeah.
Linus came to the U.S. claiming to be a displaced person, victim of the war, and he lived quietly in New York for decades.
Wow, decades.
Yeah. But he was actually the former commandant of a Nazi concentration camp in Estonia. He literally oversaw the execution of civilians. So when the government finally discovered this, they didn't just deport him, they denaturalized him.
Because he lied on the application.
Right. That is the core of it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the government views the naturalization application as a sacred contract. If you obtain that citizenship by concealing a material fact that would have disqualified you, the contract is void.
So it's like a national immune system. It was designed to reject these extreme existential threats.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Nazis. The government also used it against terrorists, like Ayman Farris, who was stripped of his citizenship for scouting the Brooklyn Bridge for al-Qaeda, or Resmio Oda, who was deported for hiding her conviction for a fatal bombing in Jerusalem.
Oh, wow. But it wasn't always just war criminals and terrorists, right? I saw Emma Goldman in the notes you brought. She was a famous anarchist deported way back in 1919. How did her case work?
Yeah, Goldman is a fascinating curiosity because her case shows how the government uses administrative loopholes. They actually denaturalized her husband to revoke her citizenship because laws back then tied a woman's status to her spouse.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, the mechanism was different, but the goal was the same, removing a perceived threat to the state. And Bhagat Singh Thind is another historical example. He temporarily lost his citizenship in the 1920s because of racial exclusion laws at the time.
Okay, so that feels like a massive pivot, though. If this legal mechanism was built to catch literal camp commandants and early 20th century anarchists, how on earth did it evolve to target everyday financial missteps?
Well, that evolution brings us to a major shift in how the Department of Justice handles civil enforcement today, specifically a June 2025 memorandum from the DOJ Civil Division.
Okay, let me jump in here with a quick disclaimer for you listening. We're purely looking at the legal architecture of this DOJ memo as it's written in the source documents. We aren't taking any political sides here. But to understand the mechanics, we have to look at what the text actually says.
Fair enough. So the memo was issued by Assistant Attorney General Brett Shumate, operating under President Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi. And it explicitly outlines how the administration plans to use civil enforcement to advance some very specific, broad policy objectives.
And the goals listed in the text are sweeping. I mean, they include combating private sector diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. They outline efforts to end anti-Semitism in federally funded entities,
Right.
direct investigations into manufacturers tied to transgender treatments for minors, and outline legal action against sanctuary jurisdictions.
Yeah. And nestled within that broad framework of aggressive civil enforcement is a dedicated section titled prioritizing denaturalization.
Hmm.
It literally orders civil division attorneys to maximally pursue denaturalization proceedings.
But hold on, why use the civil division for this? These sound like ideological goals, or in the case of fraud, criminal issues. Why is a branch usually reserved for suing corporations for money suddenly the tip of the spear for immigration enforcement?
That is the million-dollar question. And it really comes down to the burden of proof. In a criminal court, prosecutors have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a very high bar.
Right.
But in a civil court, the standards are different and often easier to meet. It allows the government to cast a much wider net.
Okay, let's unpack this. What does this net catch? Because they are putting Medicaid fraud on the exact same priority list as espionage and war crimes.
Yeah, the memo lists 10 priority categories. Some of them make total sense based on the history we just talked about.
Yeah.
Priority 1 is national security threats. Priority 2 covers human rights violators.
Which tracks?
But keep reading down that list. Priority 4 targets undisclosed felonies. Priority 5 looks at human trafficking. And then you hit priority 6 and 7, which mark a huge departure.
Because they explicitly target perpetrators of financial fraud against the United States.
Exactly. They specifically name Medicaid and Medicare fraud and Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP loan fraud.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If someone steals $500,000 from a pandemic relief fund or defrauds Medicare, why shouldn't they lose their citizenship? They broke the law. Isn't the DOJ just doing its job by going after fraudsters?
I mean, it's a valid point. The government absolutely has an interest in prosecuting fraud. But what's fascinating here is the retroactivity of it all and the scope. The DOJ lists 10 priorities, but they explicitly reserve the right to pursue denaturalization in literally any case they deem important.
Does this mean any minor infraction in these categories puts a naturalized citizen's entire life at risk?
It definitely opens the door for it. And this raises an important question about how immigrants can ever feel truly secure. If past financial paperwork is permanently subject to review, the anxiety never really ends.
So financial deception is the new frontier. Let's look at how this actually works in practice, because the immigration defense lawyers in our sources are sounding massive alarms about the legal traps this creates.
Yeah, the trap is baked right into the naturalization process itself.
Oh.
To become a citizen, an applicant must demonstrate good moral character. Typically, immigration officers evaluate the 3 to 5 years just prior to applying.
Yeah?
So if you engage in tax fraud or Medicaid fraud during that window, you legally lack good moral character and you are ineligible for citizenship.
Think about the last time you filled out a massive government form. Did you read every single line of the fine print? Because on the N-400 naturalization form, there is a very specific, incredibly dangerous question.
Oh, yeah.
It asks if you have ever committed a crime for which you were not arrested.
Right. Imagine you're sitting in your accountant's office.
Yeah.
You slightly underreport your cash income on your taxes. Or maybe you take out a PPP loan for a small side business that didn't strictly qualify under the really complex rules at the time. You were never arrested.
Yeah.
Years later, you're filling out your citizenship application and you check no to that question.
And let's say a decade goes by. You're a citizen. Then the IRS audits you and finds that old tax discrepancy. Checking no on that form years ago suddenly becomes a fatal lie.
Yes, because the government argues you concealed a material fact. You lied under oath, meaning you lacked good moral character at the time you applied. Therefore, your citizenship was illegally procured.
I want to go back to what you said about the burden of proof, because this is where the legal jargon gets a little dense. The advisories say civil denaturalization doesn't require a criminal conviction. They only need clear, convincing, and unequivocal evidence. What does that actually mean?
Think of it like a scare case. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the top step. It means the jury is practically certain you committed the crime. Clear and convincing evidence is a step or two below that. It means it is highly probable that your claim is true.
Got it.
So the government doesn't need to put you in jail to take away your passport. They just need to convince a civil judge that it's highly probable you lied on your form.
And there is no statute of limitations here. The DOJ can reopen cases decades later. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Imagine
It's like
finding out
thinking
your
you've
electric
crossed
bill
the finish line
is
of a
secretly
marathon
funding the
holding your
government's
trophy,
massive
but the
spending
judges
addiction.
review the
It is
tape
a
10
pretty
years
shocking
later.
realization
And they
when
see
you
you
actually
stepped
look at the
half an
math.
inch out of
Right.
bounds at
Well,
mile 2.
imagine for a second
So
that
they
you
show
have
up
a
at your
savings
house a
account.
decade later and
And,
confiscate your medal.
That's
You
wild.
swore to your family,
Which
hand over
brings up a
heart,
huge concern
that
for you
this money
listening,
was strictly
especially
for
regarding
fixing a
who
leaking
this
roof.
impacts most.
You said,
When the government targets
we don't
Medicaid
fix this
fraud,
roof,
we're talking about
the house is gonna
incredibly
collapse.
complex
It's an
healthcare
existential
system.
crisis
Oh,
for the
absolutely.
house.
What if a
Exactly. It's the Save the
low-income
House fund.
immigrant
But then,
unknowingly
your car
receives
breaks down,
benefits they
you
weren't
spend a little too
technically
much on
eligible
groceries,
for?
you've
This
got
seems
bills
to
piling
conflate
up.
confusing
So what do you
healthcare
do?
bureaucracy
You raid the roof
with
fund.
hardcore
You take that money
immigration
and pay off your
enforcement.
credit cards
It totally
and tell your
does. The
family,
law
hey, don't
says
worry, we'll
intent
fix the
is
roof
supposed to
later.
matter,
Right.
right?
And
an
in this
honest
scenario,
mistake on a
the
confusing
roof is
tax
the plan.
form is
Or at least
legally
Maryland's
different from
climate
willful
goals.
misrepresentation.
And the car is a
But when the
massive,
massive machinery of the federal government decides to audit your
$1.5
past,
billion
the burden effectively falls on you
A
to prove
completely
you didn't
avoidable
mean to
deficit,
deceive
I might add.
anyone.
Welcome to the deep
Defending
dive.
yourself against a
Today
federal
we're
civil
exploring a
lawsuit takes
classic
years
case of
and
fiscal
costs a
sleight of
fortune.
hand coming out of
Okay,
Annapolis.
let's ground all this
We are
legal
looking
theory
at the
in
Strategic
reality.
Energy
How does
Investment
the
Fund.
DOJ actually
SAFE.
execute this?
It's a
We have a
huge
case
pot
from
of
March
money
2026
meant to
out
save
of
the
South
environment,
Florida
but it's
involving a
turning
man
into a
named
hidden
Joss
tax
Sten
on
Roy
every single
Filson.
person paying an electric bill in Maryland. Of pandemic
It really
relief
is.
fraud,
It's become the
meaning
center of a huge
denaturalization.
political fight.
Phyllis
You've
Stein is
got
a
a
Haitian
Democratic
national
governor,
who got
frustrated
involved in a massive
environmentalists making some
$3.8
very
million
awkward compromises,
COVID-19 relief
and
fraud
conservative
scheme.
critics
That
who
is
are
a lot
rightly
of
calling
money.
this whole
Yeah,
thing
he
a shell
personally
game.
pocketed
shell
over
game.
$549,000
And when you look at the
in
documents we have
kickbacks by
today,
preparing fake
reports,
loan applications.
budget
Wow.
proposals,
But the
critiques from Senate
timeline is the
Republicans,
smoking gun here,
it is
right?
really hard
Exactly.
to unsee it.
Our
The
mission
fraud
for
was
this
happening
deep dive
between
is
April
simple.
2020
Follow the
and
money.
May 2021.
Always follow the
And in
money.
December
We are going to
2020,
see
literally
how a
right in the
fund
middle of his
designed
crime
to
spree,
fight
he sits
climate
down for
change
his sworn
is being used to
naturalization
plug
interview.
holes in the state
He looks
budget.
an officer in the eye
And we'll
and
dig
says
into
he
the
hasn't
argument
committed any
that this
crimes.
isn't
2
found
months
money
later,
at
he's
all.
handed
This
his
is essentially a
citizenship
backdoor
certificate.
tax
But
on
the law
families.
eventually caught
Let's
up.
get right into
He was
it.
criminally
The
charged,
Strategic Energy
pled guilty to
Investment
wire
Fund. It sounds
fraud,
very official,
and then a
very
federal jury
important.
separately
What does it
found him
actually
guilty
do?
of
Well,
obtaining his
on
citizenship
paper,
contrary
it is the
to
state's
law.
green piggy
In
bank.
2026,
SIF
the
is
court
managed by
officially
the
revoked
Maryland
his
Energy
U.S. citizenship.
Administration. Its whole stated
Okay, so
purpose
that's a
is to reduce
clear-cut
energy bills,
$500,000
cut
intentional
waste,
fraud
and
case. I
fund
get that.
renewable
But
energy.
the DOJ
Like
isn't
solar
just hunting
panels and
whales.
efficiency
They are
upgrades.
going after
Exactly.
minnows, too.
But here is the real
Look at
aha
Norma
moment of the
Borgono, the
story.
Miami grandmother from Peru,
Where
who
does
was
the money
sued by the
actually
DOJ for a
come
federal
from?
fraud offense
Because they
committed
aren't just
prior to her
taxing you
citizenship
directly
grant.
for it. Or the unnamed
No, and that's
woman
why
in Houston
politicians
from our
absolutely
Yeah,
love
the
it. It feels
Houston
free.
case is really
So
chilling
about 40%
because of the scale.
comes from regional
She faced
carbon auction.
denaturalization proceedings
But the big
years
chunk,
after
the
becoming
one
a
growing
citizen
like crazy,
for crime.
comes from something called
She
alternative
underreported her
compliance
income and
payments,
received an improper
or ACPs,
$7,000
which is just a
tax
fancy
refund
government term for
prior
a
to her
fine.
naturalization.
It's a fine for failure.
Let me break it down. Maryland law
Yeah.
forces
She later
utility
pled
companies
guilty to
buy
filing a false
certain
tax
amount
return.
of green energy.
The DOJ
They have to
swooped
prove
in
they're
and
using
successfully
renewables.
argued that this
But if they can't
relatively
find that
minor
green
tax
energy,
issue
or if it's
showed
just
she
way too
lacked good
expensive on the
moral
market,
character when
which
she
it
applied.
usually is.
Her
Yeah, the
citizenship
state
was
gives them an
invalidated
escape
over
hatch.
$7,000.
The utility
So
can just
a
pay a
criminal
fee
defense
directly to
attorney's
the
job
state
isn't
instead.
just about
That fee is
minimizing
the
jail
ACP.
time anymore. It's
And
literally
here's the
about
kicker.
protecting a client's
Utilities
US
are
passport.
increasingly just
That
paying
is
the
exactly
fine
what
because
the
it's
Immigrant
cheaper than
Defense
actually
Project memo
buying
points
the
out.
green energy.
They cite
Wait,
Padilla
so
v.
the
Kentucky
climate fund
and a
is getting
2024 Second
incredibly
Circuit
rich.
ruling. Defense attorneys are now
Precisely
constitutionally
because
mandated to
the green
warn
energy
naturalized
mandates are
clients
failing.
that pleading
Precisely.
guilty to
It
certain
is a
crimes could trigger
completely perverse
denaturalization.
incentive.
Which has to have
The
a
government
massive
made
chilling
the
effect.
mandates
Huge.
so aggressive and the
It
market
means
is
a
so
naturalized
distorted
citizen
that power companies are
negotiating
just
a plea
writing checks
deal
to
for
the
a
state
past
instead of
financial
going
crime
green.
And the
is
stats on this
inadvertently
are just
negotiating the right to
staggering.
remain
They
in the country.
Wow.
In 2022,
We
this
have
revenue
covered a
was
massive amount of
$77
ground
million.
today.
We started by
By
looking at how this
2025,
tool was
it jumped to
forged to remove Nazi camp
$365
commandants
million.
hiding in plain sight.
Wow.
Right.
From
And we trace how that
77
same
million
legal
to
machinery has been
365 million in
recalibrated.
3 years.
Right,
The
so now the
modern
state has
DOJ's
this
aggressive 10-point
massive
priority list
accidental pot
targets
of gold.
tax errors,
It's supposedly
PPP
for green
fraud,
projects.
and Medicaid missteps.
But remember, that
And this
money
matters
didn't just
deeply
fall
for
out
you
of the
listening.
sky.
It
It
proves
proves
that
that
bureaucratic
bureaucratic
forms
forms
and
and
historical
historical actions
And
And do you think those
quietly shape
massive
the ultimate
corporations
legal
just eat
status,
that cost,
turning
out
what
of the goodness
most
of their
assume
hearts?
is a permanent
Oh,
safe
absolutely not.
harbor
They pass
into a conditional
every single
lease.
penny of that
Yeah,
onto
it's
the
pretty
customer.
sobering.
Exactly.
Which
It
leaves
shows
us
up
with the
right on your
final
electric bill.
lingering
So
question
you,
for you to
the everyday
ponder.
ratepayer, are
If
paying for the
citizenship can be
utility's failure
retroactively
to meet a
revoked
government
for
mandate.
financial mistakes
The
made
state
before
collects your money,
naturalization,
drops it in
does
the
this
safe,
effectively
and says,
create
look
two
at all this
different
cash we
tiers
have
of
for the
American
climate.
citizens?
Which brings us to the
Those
rate.
born here who can commit crimes
Because
without
that money
ever
is
losing their
definitely not
nationality,
staying in the
and
climate
naturalized
fund.
citizens
Not
who
anymore.
must
Enter
ensure their
Governor
past
Wes
remains
Moore.
forever flawless.
His administration
You know that
is staring
permanent
down a
marker we talked about
projected
at the beginning?
$1.5
It turns
billion
out, for millions
budget
of Americans,
deficit.
the ink never actually
$1.5 billion.
dries.